Good morning. It's nice to be in front of everybody again. And I was going to try to make a joke, but I'm not going to make any jokes. So let me just jump right into it. I'm rereading part of the passage that was read beautifully this morning already. So just in Isaiah, this is in chapter 9, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. So this clearly is a message of hope and encouragement. And, those are often given when things are bad, could turn bad, and they're most needed when things look hopeless. Isaiah's words were delivered to a people who were divided, spiritually confused, at the mercy of the whims of those in political power, and facing real threats from outside nations. So these themes of division, divisiveness, spiritual confusion, politics. I think these are all worries that are common for us today in December of 2025. It's hard to, if you are on social media or read the news, it's hard to have a single day go by without a headline kind of talking about one of these items. And so just wanted to spend a little bit of time reflecting on the state of the world back when this message was given. And as I go through that, you can consider the similarities to today. In terms of division, God's people were at one time, at least intended to be unified in their allegiance to him. And I'm surprised that people remember these things, but I get told once in a while, if you have a good memory and can dig back in your minds, almost a year ago when I spoke last time during Advent, I had reviewed the Mosaic covenant, the agreement between God and the Israelites, where God gave the Israelites the law and promised in return their special status of to be God's set-apart people. They were unified as a people who were looking to him for leadership and guidance. And we talked about how God's people were led under the chosen patriarchs and prophets for a while, but over time, as we get to the time period in Isaiah, the people had transitioned from being led by God's chosen leaders to a people demanding other forms of government, and where their motives were not driven from being aligned with God, but rather motives like power or wanting to be like other nations. These desires eventually led to disagreements over issues that we see today too: economics, labor, culture, how to practice religion, and led to a complete split of the people into two separate nations ruled by different kings and decades of war. Just like today, you can't, as I mentioned, turn on the news without hearing these same themes, these signs of deep division in our country. Just like in the time of Isaiah, many of us have picked our sides, and often it's not really based on following God. And I want to point out, though, that the main causes of this division aren't these obvious debate points that surface, like economics, labor, culture, religion, but we see in the Bible this kind of the source or this personal division existing even in the earliest stories. We see just in Adam and Eve, blame, Cain and Abel, jealousy, Isaac and Esau, favoritism and deception, Joseph and his brothers, pride, envy, anger. In each generation, we see this divisiveness, division that begins in the human heart before it shows up in public life. And so, one of the things going on in this time is just a sense of division. Also, spiritual confusion. The people, in particular, the northern kingdom of Israel, had very much rejected God. And you read in the previous chapters of Isaiah, idolatry was common. Idolatry, replacing our worship and desire for God with something else, which is also something I think really common for us today. Perhaps not the same in terms of creating a golden calf and bowing to it, but the idea that, instead of seeking out what God has called us to do, that we can somehow control our fates through performing certain actions just to get what we want is something really alluring. Idols at that time and now promise this guarantee. If you say the right words, do the right incantation, do the right spell or whatever, bow to the right object, that whatever that God it is will show up for you. Idolatry is just about really serving yourself. At the time, many of the idols were like physical being, like crafted in physical beings or animals, like calves, and you need to feed them. Sacrifices were brought to the gods, and because if they were hungry, you give them food, they'll give you what you want. These idols asked little in return. They were convenient. Besides your just physical sacrifice, you bring your whatever pigeon or whatever you cook there. You kind of go, you drop off your offering, and things are good. Besides your physical sacrifice, there wasn't a demand for you to change your a personal sacrifice or an ethical standard. You could just give that offering and be done with your duties. Idolatry was really pleasing to the senses. There was this appeal to aesthetics and beauty and just a focus on something to see and do, entertainment, indulgence, and relevance. So there was also this time of spiritual confusion at the time. And then kind of the immediate threat was a threat from outside nations. So in the previous chapter, it lays out the pending threat to God's people. I'm not a historian, so I always feel uncertain talking about history that happens in the Bible. But as I understand it, the Assyrians were another nation, and kind of as a result of God's people turning away from him, what was pretty much promised or announced in Isaiah was the resulting downfall of Israel and great harm to Judah. It reads in Isaiah 8:6-8, because this people has refused the waters of Shiloah that flow gently and rejoice over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria, and all his glory. And it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks and will sweep into Judah and it will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck. And its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. And so, with this kind of very poetic language, though, it's describing this attack from the Assyrians, which I've never been in a big flood, but imagine a flood coming up and kind of wiping out the land or coming all the way up to your neck, something very, pretty scary. So, our passage here where we pick up, it describes, that's kind of the background, this sense of division, spiritual confusion, and almost impending doom that's pronounced upon the people. And the passage describes this cumulative effect of these pressures as this feeling of darkness, this overwhelming feeling of being in the dark or deep darkness. And so what do we associate with darkness? Is anyone afraid of the dark? All right, no one. Good. Well, then this message won't work if no one's afraid of the dark. But yeah, I think, common associations with being in the dark: fear, uncertainty, lack of vision, an inability to navigate. In the deepest dark, you don't even know what direction you're facing. And then if we stay in it long enough, depression, a sense of being lost, not just in terms of what direction you need to go, but often in purpose. I'm sure a lot of you are feeling the effects of shorter days and longer nights of winter, which hasn't helped by this gray fog that we've had over Sacramento for, I think, 3 weeks now. I've heard from many folks I've talked to just at home, at work, how just this season in particular, for some reason, is really leading to a feeling of gloom and depression. And Isaiah uses the phrase specifically walking in darkness and living in the land of deep darkness. Walking in and living in. Walking, an active verb, and living in something that kind of denotes it's become your reality. So what does it mean for one to walk in darkness or live in it? How do you find yourself there? What are the types of, how does that happen? Literally, as I was trying to think for a moment about these things as I was preparing, I don't know if you've ever had to walk in the darkness. Some things I could come up with are, one, just urgency. You think you need to get somewhere, and you can't wait till it gets light, and you've decided you need to get somewhere, whether there's light to guide you there or not. So often this sense of urgency that we feel, whether good or bad, leads us to set out, perhaps without direction, perhaps without knowing exactly where we're going, but we're just kind of compelled to do something. There's also, sometimes we end up in the darkness just because of necessity. There's something in the daylight, perhaps, that you want to avoid. You don't want to be seen in the day doing whatever you're doing, and so you decide to set out at night. Other ways you might end up walking in the dark, you're late or lost, and the day has turned to night. I used to do a lot of hiking and climbing, and there's always this term called being benighted, where you've set out with the best intentions to finish your hike or climb, and then unfortunately for you, it gets dark, and then you have to spend your night camped outside or on a mountaintop. But yeah, there's this idea that sometimes things happen and you end up in the dark. But I think one way to categorize how all these things, in terms of how we end up in darkness, are either, by choice, by force, or by chance. By choice, sometimes we are walking in darkness because of the decisions that we've made. It can be as straightforward and obvious as turning away from God on purpose. We know we're not supposed to do something, and we go do it anyway. I think that's quite common. But oftentimes it's more gradual. It's the natural outcome of just living life and choosing the multiple paths that we go on. Not necessarily even something inherently bad, but just as we travel along without God's guidance in certain areas of our life, we just find ourselves one day in this area of our life in darkness. The other category, by force, sometimes we end up in these circumstances not by our choice at all. I'm sure a lot of folks in the time of Isaiah, it's easy to characterize this whole nation as kind of abandoning God, but just based on the relationships that you have, based on the circumstance, sometimes you're just forced into something that's not great. In our lives today, it could be the betrayal or actions of someone else, just some toxic work environment, outcomes of the systems we live in or circumstances. And, oftentimes we end up in these dark places by chance. I know Pastor Mark has spoken before that there's no such thing as just pure chance, but you can certainly just look at some things in your life, and often, at least from our vantage point at the time, there's no good explanation. So, yeah, that's just ways you can end up in the dark. This is a really uplifting message so far. But I think it's helpful just to reflect on this stuff. Part of me, as I was preparing this and writing it, really hoped that none of these reflections resonated with anybody, because it is quite depressing just to think about darkness, especially at this time. It's not really fitting for what we often coin the most wonderful time of the year. But I know from more than a few conversations I've had just in the past week that this fear of darkness, the overall weight of darkness, it's just really common around this time of year. It's really easy to put on a facade of joyfulness for the holiday season, to hide behind a smile. I was going to wear a fancy sweater or like a Christmas sweater or presents, but when inside, some folks just really do feel kind of lost. Just some examples. One of my close friends, he recently just lost his job and was messaging me the other day saying he's just down to the food in his fridge and he doesn't know what to do. Last week I went to my 20th high school reunion, which is crazy. And it's a time where you get to compare yourself to everyone else. I grew up in a very competitive school district, so it's very strange to see folks and you're like, oh, you sold your startup for $100 million and you did this. But in the midst of all that, I heard more than one person really kind of test the waters with some real talk, where folks would, you haven't seen these folks in 10, 20 years, and they say to you, oh, things are really rough with the spouse at home, or are you happy? I can't say confidently that I'm happy. And then, talking with other folks right now just about calling and uncertainty, just as you reflect upon, often when you reflect upon the year and what you've done, so many folks look back and say, I don't know if I'm in the right job, I don't know if I have the right hobbies, spending time with the right friends, investing my time in the right places. And so, I wanted us to reflect a minute just on kind of our lives and whether there are parts of your life where you're kind of feeling this darkness too. Where in your life are you feeling uncertain or afraid or lost in your direction? Where in your life maybe you can sense division, perhaps from past relationships that have gone cold? What are your worries about pending threats? Are you walking through darkness? Would you classify it as living in deep darkness? Just spend some time thinking about that. So, just based on my past conversations in this week, I just know that these issues exist, but in the midst of this spiritual darkness and this impending doom, the text for today picks up with a message of hope and a spark of joy, to give hope in the midst of these exact circumstances. So it says, the people have seen a great light. This light has dawned. Just speaking physically, when you're in darkness, light changes everything. When you're in darkness, the light brings in clarity. You can see yourself, you can see your path, you can see your situation more truthfully. Direction. You can take your next steps with confidence when you can actually see the floor. Comfort. Often the presence of light immediately removes the fear of the unknown. It brings hope. Even that flicker tells you that the darkness that you've been experiencing, it won't last forever. And it reorientates you, whatever direction you're facing in the dark, when you see that light, you immediately shift. Your posture shifts. So the season of Advent is really a season of waiting, living with longings that haven't been fulfilled. And we remember that before Jesus came, the world sat in this deep darkness that Isaiah describes. But God didn't stay far away. The good news of the gospel is that in that darkness, Jesus entered it himself. We listed earlier just reasons for why people end up in darkness, often mentioned. It's by your choices, kind of like your bad choices, maybe to do something you don't want to be seen, or maybe you're dragged there by someone else and it wasn't your choice. What is really unique, or I guess before I say that, oftentimes these things are self-serving choices or being forced by others, and it's rare, if ever, instead based on a selfless act of choice. But in the gospel, while we were in the darkness, Jesus decided to enter into that darkness for us to bring us light. And the second half of the passage that we looked at today, really brings comfort. It says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given." When reflecting on some of my most joyful moments in life, birth of my children are really high on my list. It's always a way that I think joy comes in the world. It says, "The government will be on his shoulders." So to the people weary of political instability, this was a promise of God's lasting authority. And he'll be called Wonderful Counselor. Specific to those who are lost in the dark and needing guidance of a counselor, he is the Wonderful Counselor. Mighty God, for those feeling powerless to pull themselves out of darkness, he is the strong one. Everlasting Father, for those feeling abandoned, he is the ultimate Father, ultimate provider, and Prince of Peace. In terms of light, the Gospel of John really echoes Isaiah's promise of Jesus, the light. John 1:3-4, it says, "All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And so his very presence brings that light in the darkness. John 8:12, he says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." So, he doesn't just shine, he really leads us out of the darkness as a guide. And John 12:46, "I have come into the world as light so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness." So again, Jesus came because the world was dark. Not going to spend too much longer just in this message. I promised Mark I'd be very short. So, but a few kind of thoughts just to conclude this reflection on darkness and light. And especially the theme of today, which is supposed to be joy. How can we have joy in the midst of this darkness? Joy is not really the absence of the darkness, but really it's the presence of the light within it, and specifically allowing that light to guide you and shine upon you. One thing is, it's not really automatic. For some of us, we may have chosen to keep certain areas of our life in the dark specifically because we don't want the light to shine upon them. The light exposes what hides in the darkness and often may be calling for us to shut off certain behaviors and practices. And as we do that, we may be initially met with resistance from our minds, our friends, or families, but I think the joy and peace really comes from knowing that God is in control and following his lead. One thing this passage really reminds me of is in Psalm 1. It says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked." So, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. Our passage in Isaiah talks about walking in the darkness and living in deep darkness. And Psalm 1 kind of also describes this same potential progression that occurs when one begins to reside more permanently in things that are not beneficial. Walking in places we shouldn't be, deciding to stand around there, and finally sitting down and becoming the scoffer. But it kind of contrasts that behavior. Where this joy comes from is really being, again, planted in the streams of water, basically rooted in God's word and meditating in it. And, one thing I noticed here, it says it yields its fruit in season. And kind of my new thought on that, it's like these trees don't yield fruit like year-round all the time. It's not always there. Even for our trees, I saw there's lemons there, so I guess lemons may be fruit in the winter. Trees fruit at different times. Sometimes they don't look like things are like so hot for them when all their leaves fall off, but things come. Anyway, where am I going with this? Even for these trees that are there are seasons where, there's no fruit on the tree, things look barren, things are tough. The key to their long-lasting longevity is kind of that constant supply of nutrients and water from the soil. And even though there might not be visible fruit, sometimes there's stuff going on that's making it happen. The leaves are not withering. So I wanted to end kind of this message with just some thinking on what can we do practically for others. Especially, some of us might be feeling some of this darkness. Others, hopefully everyone here doesn't feel any of that, and you're feeling great. But as we think about those around us and we see it, how do we respond? In those conversations I mentioned before, I'll just share some of the struggles that I have. It's very challenging to figure out what to say in the moment when your friend says, I've only got food in the fridge and that's all I have, or things are really hard for me. Because one, I don't want to lie. I don't want to say with confidence that things are going to turn out great when or let's say not great, but turn out the way that they want to, if I can't promise, that a job's around the corner, or a relationship will be mended, or, for just folks that the main complaint is it's foggy, that the fog is going to lift tomorrow. I think it's going to rain this coming week. Nor are we always equipped or capable or well trained to just walk through those circumstances with folks like our chaplains are. Shout out to the chaplains. And often, right, for I was going to say younger folks. Do I still count as a younger folk? Yeah. Just having the life experience, the wisdom to look back and draw upon many stories of encouragement and things that you've overcome in your life. The list goes on and on. And so just personally, it's often a struggle for me to kind of provide something of substance in those times. But one thing is true is that we do have the Word of God. We have this passage here. And that is, I think, one area that we can turn. The promises of God are true. And here, again, we hear that even in the midst of this darkness, for the folks walking in darkness, living in darkness, it says they have seen a great light, and the light has dawned. And I think that's something that can really bring joy as we reflect and kind of just meditate on that the joy that we can lean into and rely upon in this season, even if things seem dark, is that Jesus, even though things were kind of at the darkest time, entered the world to kind of bring us out of there.